You can build a $45 million resort on my land, but you can't build it on a lie. That was the sentence I whispered to myself as I stood at the edge of my property line, watching a luxury development rise where my family's old pasture used to be. The sound reached me before the sight did. The deep rumble of excavators rolled across the valley. The sharp clank of steel beams echoed through the morning air, and the smell of fresh concrete mixed with diesel fumes hung heavy around me. For most people, it looked like progress. For me, it looked like someone was turning my family's history into a business they never had permission to build. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for 3 generations, my family owned those 120 acres outside Bozeman, Montana. My grandfather bought that land in 1968, back when the nearest town still had more farms than coffee shops. He built a small cabin near the tree line, repaired fences by hand, and taught my father one simple rule: land is more than dirt. It is a promise. I carried that promise with me every time I walked those fields. I knew every trail, every old fence post, every corner where the grass grew taller after summer rain. Then Victoria Whitmore arrived. Victoria was the president of Silver Pines Estates HOA, and she had a vision. Not a vision for the neighborhood, a vision for control. She arrived in a spotless white Mercedes SUV, carrying expensive folders and a confidence that made it seem like every door already belonged to her. She called it a community expansion project. I called it something else. A mistake. The first time I saw the construction plans, I thought there had to be some misunderstanding. The blueprints showed a luxury resort with private cabins, a restaurant, a conference center, and a massive recreation area. The problem was one small detail. A large section of that resort sat directly on my property. When I confronted Victoria, she didn't look surprised. She smiled, adjusted the papers in her hand, and said, "Mr. Caldwell, this land is part of the Silver Pines Development Agreement now." The way she said it was almost casual, like she was explaining a neighborhood rule about mailbox colors. She wasn't asking. She was informing me. I could have argued. I could have stood there and shouted until the entire construction crew stopped working. But something inside me told me to stay calm. Because people like Victoria make one mistake. They believe silence means weakness. They don't understand that sometimes silence means someone is paying attention. So I looked at the resort rising on my family's land, watched millions of dollars being poured into a project built on confidence and paperwork, and I made a decision. I would let them continue. I would let them believe they had won. Because Victoria Whitmore didn't know what was sitting inside my old cabin. She didn't know what my grandfather had carefully protected for decades. And she definitely didn't know that the most important piece of land in her $45 million dream was still legally mine. The first thing my father taught me about land was that the paperwork matters just as much as the memories. I was 8 years old when he placed an old survey map on the kitchen table and showed me the faded lines that marked our property boundaries. The paper was worn at the edges, the ink slightly faded from decades of use. But to him, it was more valuable than anything sitting in a bank vault. A fence can fall down, he told me. A building can disappear. But the truth stays in the records. I never forgot those words. Years later, standing in front of a luxury resort being built across that same land, I understood exactly what he meant. Before Silver Pines Estates ever existed, before Victoria Whitmore had her polished offices and carefully planned expansion, that land was just a quiet piece of Montana countryside. My grandfather, Samuel Caldwell, purchased it after returning home from years of working construction across the western United States. He was not a wealthy man. He did not own fancy cars or chase business deals. He owned a pickup truck, a toolbox, and a belief that anything worth having was worth protecting. He built the small cabin himself with lumber he selected by hand. I still remember the smell of pine inside those walls and the sound of the old wood floor creaking beneath my boots when I visited as a kid. My father spent his life maintaining the property. He repaired the fences, cleared fallen branches after storms, and kept the land exactly the way my grandfather left it. There was something peaceful about that place. No traffic noise, no crowds, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional call of wildlife in the distance. When my father passed away, the responsibility of protecting the property became mine. I became a civil engineer because I enjoyed understanding how things were built. Roads, bridges, foundations, drainage systems. I spent 30 years studying the details that most people ignored. And that experience taught me something important. Every structure has a weakness. Every project has a mistake waiting to be discovered. When Victoria Whitmore first approached me about future development opportunities, I thought she was simply another investor looking for land. I was wrong. She was not interested in buying my property. She was interested in making everyone believe she already owned it. Her confidence came from money, connections, and the assumption that nobody would challenge her. She had an entire team behind her. Lawyers, developers, contractors, people who saw my land as a blank space on a blueprint instead of a place with a history. But what they did not understand was that I had something they did not have. Patience. I did not need to rush. I did not need to make threats. I only needed to know the truth was on my side. Every morning when I watched those construction crews arrive, I remembered my grandfather standing on that same ground decades earlier. He built something simple, something honest. Victoria was building something impressive, but she had forgotten the most important foundation of all. Ownership is not decided by confidence. It is decided by the truth written in the records. The first time I met Victoria Whitmore, she was standing beside a freshly printed development map, smiling like she had already won a battle that had never started. The wind was moving across the field behind her, carrying the smell of cut grass and construction dust, but she acted like she was standing in the middle of a boardroom instead of on someone else's property. She looked at the land the way a real estate investor looks at an empty lot. She saw numbers. I saw history. Victoria was the president of Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association, and she had built a reputation for turning ordinary neighborhoods into what she called premium communities. To her, that meant matching houses, controlled landscaping, private amenities, and rules that seemed to grow longer every year. She believed every detail could be managed if the right person had enough authority. And in her mind, she was that person. When she first approached me, she did not ask about buying the land. She spoke as if the decision had already been made. She explained that Silver Pines Estates was planning a major expansion project that would benefit everyone in the area. The way she said it made it sound generous. But every sentence carried the same message. She expected me to agree. She expected me to step aside. I remember standing there with my hands in my jacket pockets, looking at the printed plans she handed me. The paper was smooth, expensive, and covered with impressive images of a luxury resort. There were drawings of guest cabins, walking paths, event spaces, and a beautiful entrance that would sit exactly where my grandfather's old fence line had been for more than 50 years. I pointed to the property boundary on the map and asked a simple question. Why is my land included in this plan? Victoria did not hesitate. She gave me the kind of smile people use when they think they are explaining something obvious to someone who does not understand. She said the area had become part of the community development agreement and that everything had been reviewed by their professionals. Their professionals. That phrase stayed with me. Because I knew something about professionals. I had spent decades working with engineers, inspectors, and contractors. Real professionals checked every measurement. They verified every document. They respected every boundary. They did not simply assume ownership because a project looked expensive. Over the next few weeks, I watched Victoria move faster than I expected. Survey. Crews arrived. Equipment rolled across the fields. Wooden stakes appeared in the ground. Every morning, the sound of engines replaced the quiet mornings I grew up with. Neighbors started talking about the resort like it was already finished. They talked about property values, new opportunities, and the future of the community. Nobody wanted to ask the uncomfortable question. Nobody wanted to know whether the foundation of this entire project was built on something that did not belong to them. Victoria thought she had created something unstoppable. She thought a large budget and confident words could erase a family's ownership. But she had never taken the time to understand who she was dealing with. I was not interested in creating a public fight. I was interested in facts. And while everyone else was watching the buildings rise, I was quietly watching the paperwork. The first sign that Victoria Whitmore was no longer asking for permission came on a Tuesday morning when I found a stack of official-looking documents sitting inside my mailbox. The paper was thick, the printing was clean, and the Silver Pines Estates logo was placed at the top like it carried the authority of a government office. I stood there on my porch, feeling the cold Montana air against my face, and read every line carefully. According to Victoria, my property was now part of a community expansion project. According to Victoria, Construction would continue. According to Victoria, I had a responsibility to cooperate. But according to the records I had been reviewing, none of that made sense. The problem was not the size of her project. The problem was the assumption behind it. She believed that because her team had prepared documents, everyone else would simply accept them. That was how Victoria operated. She created an appearance of certainty, and most people never looked deeper. I did. My years as a civil engineer taught me something important. The smallest details usually reveal the biggest mistakes. A measurement that is off by a few inches. A date that does not match. A signature placed where it should not be. Those details matter. Over the next several weeks, Silver Pines Estates moved forward like nothing was wrong. Construction crews arrived before sunrise. The sound of machinery echoed through the valley. The peaceful land where my grandfather once repaired fences was slowly transforming into a massive development project. I watched workers install foundations, build access roads, and prepare the area for what Victoria called the future of luxury living. Every day, the resort became more impressive. Every day, Victoria became more confident. She started appearing at community meetings, showing investors the progress, and talking about the expansion as if my property had always been part of her plan. One afternoon, she stopped by my house again. This time, she brought 2 members of her development team. They stood behind her with folders in their hands while she explained that fighting the project would only create unnecessary problems. She said I should think about the bigger picture. She said everyone would benefit. She said I was holding back progress. I looked past her shoulder toward the old oak tree near the edge of my property. My grandfather planted that tree decades ago. It was still standing there, unchanged while everything around it moved faster and faster. I told Victoria I needed time to review everything. She smiled like she had expected that answer. She thanked me for being reasonable and walked back toward her vehicle. But she did not understand something. I was not delaying because I was unsure. I was waiting because I wanted to see how far she would go. The more money they invested, the more confident they became. The more confident they became, the more evidence they created. Every construction permit, every public announcement, every contract, every document connected to the project was becoming part of a record that told a very different story from the one Victoria was selling. She thought she was building a resort. She did not realize she was building the strongest evidence against herself. For the first time since this entire situation started, I realized I was not fighting a person anymore. I was fighting a system built on confidence, paperwork, and the belief that nobody would ever question it. The turning point came when I received a letter from Silver Pines Estates informing me that construction would officially move into its final phase. I stood in my kitchen holding that letter, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, while outside the window the land my family had protected for decades was being transformed into someone else's business opportunity. The words on the page were carefully chosen. They talked about progress. They talked about community growth. They talked about partnership. But nowhere did they talk about ownership. That was the detail Victoria Whitmore kept avoiding. I spent the next few weeks doing what I knew how to do. I studied the documents. I compared records. I followed every reference and every property description back to its original source. My old engineering habits came back naturally. I treated the paperwork like a blueprint. If something did not line up, I marked it. If something seemed unusual, I investigated it. The deeper I looked, the more questions appeared. The property maps used by Silver Pines Estates showed boundaries that did not match the county records. The development plans referenced agreements that I had never signed. There were assumptions everywhere, but very little proof. Meanwhile, Victoria continued presenting the resort as a guaranteed success. She hosted meetings, celebrated milestones, and showed potential buyers images of the finished development. She talked about the resort like it was already part of her legacy. The community saw the beautiful buildings rising from the ground. They saw the expensive landscaping, the carefully designed entrances, and the promise of higher property values. They did not see what I saw. They did not see the missing pieces. One evening, I drove back to the property just before sunset. The construction lights were glowing across the field, and the unfinished buildings cast long shadows over the land. I walked toward the old cabin my grandfather built, placed my hand against the wooden door, and remembered his words about protecting what matters. For a moment, I wondered if I should have fought harder in the beginning. Maybe I should have stopped the project immediately. Maybe I should have made more noise. But then I looked at everything Victoria had built. millions of dollars invested, hundreds of pages of documents created, a public record that showed exactly what decisions had been made and who had made them. That was when I understood something. Victoria thought time was working in her favor. She thought every day of construction made her position stronger. She was wrong. Every day was creating a clearer picture of what had happened. I was not losing control of my land. I was gathering the evidence that would prove I never lost it. And while Victoria celebrated the progress of her dream project, I quietly prepared for the moment when the truth would finally have its day. The old wooden floor of my grandfather's cabin creaked beneath my boots as I opened the one place I had not looked in years. A small storage compartment beneath the floorboard sat covered in dust, hidden from anyone who did not know it existed. I remembered my grandfather telling me that some things were worth protecting, not because they were expensive, but because they carried the truth. I reached inside and pulled out a weathered metal box. The hinges were rusty. The surface was covered with years of dust. But when I opened it, I knew immediately that I had found something important. Inside were documents my family had protected for decades. Old survey maps, property records, handwritten notes from my grandfather. And underneath everything else was the document that changed the entire situation. The original deed. I sat there in the quiet cabin, holding that piece of paper while the sounds of construction continued outside in the distance. Machines moving, workers building, a resort taking shape on land that the records showed was never transferred away from my family. I studied every page carefully. The legal description matched the county records. The boundaries matched the original surveys. The signatures were exactly where they needed to be. There was no misunderstanding, no complicated agreement, no hidden transfer of ownership. The land still belonged to me. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to smile. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to embarrass anyone. I smiled because I finally understood the position Victoria Whitmore had put herself in. She had spent millions of dollars building something impressive, but she had built it on an assumption. And assumptions do not replace legal ownership. I began organizing everything. I created copies of every document. I collected every public announcement Silver Pines Estates had made about the resort. I saved every construction record connected to the project. I documented the timeline from the first survey stakes placed in the ground to the latest development updates. Every piece mattered. Every detail created a clearer picture. When I finally contacted an attorney, I did not walk into the meeting with anger. I walked in with evidence. The attorney spent hours reviewing the documents. He looked at the original deed, then looked at the development plans, then looked back at me. He told me something I already knew. The facts were going to speak for themselves. Meanwhile, Victoria continued moving forward. The resort was nearing completion. The grand opening date was announced. Invitations were sent. Investors celebrated. She believed the finish line was close. She had no idea that the final stage of her project was not the beginning of her success. It was the moment when everything she built would be examined. I kept watching quietly. I drove past the property and saw the finished structures standing where my family once walked freely. It was strange seeing something so massive sitting on land that still carried my name. But I reminded myself of one thing. The truth does not need to be rushed. It only needs to arrive at the right moment. And that moment was getting closer. I watched the final pieces of the resort come together from the same hill where my grandfather used to sit with a cup of coffee every morning. The view had changed completely. The open fields were gone, replaced by carefully designed buildings, stone pathways, and a massive entrance sign welcoming guests to Silver Pines Estates Resort. The sound of construction had finally disappeared, replaced by the quieter sounds of preparation. Workers moved through the property, making final adjustments. Trucks delivered furniture. Landscaping crews planted the last rows of trees. Everything looked finished. Everything looked successful. And that was exactly what Victoria Whitmore wanted everyone to believe. The grand opening was only weeks away, and she was everywhere. Her name appeared in local articles. Her company shared photos of the resort online. She gave interviews talking about vision, growth, and the future of the community. She described the project as if she had created something from nothing. But every time I saw those pictures, I noticed the same thing. Nobody mentioned the land. Nobody mentioned how the project started. Nobody mentioned the person whose property boundaries surrounded the entire development. Me. By that point, most people assumed I had given up. Some neighbors even told me I should be grateful. They said the resort would increase nearby property values. They said I should stop fighting and accept what was happening. What they did not understand was that I was not fighting the resort itself. I was fighting the idea that someone could simply decide they owned something because they had enough money to build on it. I continued documenting everything. The opening announcements, the promotional materials, the construction timeline. Every public statement Victoria made became another piece of the story. She had spent months creating a record that showed exactly how confident she was. And confidence can be useful. Sometimes it reveals everything. One afternoon, I received an invitation to the official opening ceremony. My name was not on it as an owner. It was not on it as a partner. It was simply addressed as a nearby resident. I held that invitation in my hand and looked at the expensive paper, the elegant design, and the carefully chosen words. It was almost impressive. Almost. Because Victoria had made one mistake. She had confused appearance with reality. The resort looked powerful. It looked permanent. It looked like something nobody could challenge. But I knew what was underneath it. Not the foundation. Not the concrete. Not the carefully designed buildings. I knew what was underneath the entire project. Was a question that could not be ignored. Who actually owned the ground beneath it? The closer the opening day came, the calmer I became. I had spent months watching Victoria celebrate what she thought was her greatest achievement. I let her believe the hardest part was over. I let her believe she had won. Because I knew the truth was waiting. And soon, everyone else would see it too. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. After months of hearing construction equipment, investor meetings, and Victoria Whitmore's confident announcements, the silence inside that room felt completely different. No machines. No marketing. No carefully prepared speeches. Just documents, facts, and the truth sitting on the table in front of everyone. I walked in carrying a simple folder. Nothing expensive. Nothing impressive. Just copies of the records my family had protected for decades. Victoria arrived with a team of attorneys and a stack of paperwork that looked intimidating at first glance. She had built her entire argument around one idea. She believed the size of her project proved she had the right to be there. The resort was worth millions. Hundreds of people were involved. Investors had trusted her. In her mind, something that large could not possibly be wrong. But the law does not measure ownership by how much money is spent. It measures ownership by records, by agreements, by facts. The hearing began with Victoria's side explaining the development history. They talked about the planning process, the community expansion, and the investment behind the resort. They showed images of the finished property and described the benefits it would bring to the area. Anyone watching from the outside might have thought they were presenting a success story. Then it was my turn. I did not start with the resort. I did not start with Victoria. I started with the land. I placed the original deed on the table. The room became noticeably quieter. The attorney reviewing the document looked carefully at the pages, checking the legal description and comparing it with the property records. The deed was not complicated. It did not need dramatic explanations. It simply showed the truth. The land had remained in my family's name. The boundaries had never changed. The transfer Victoria's team believed existed was never completed. The entire foundation of their argument depended on something that was not there. I watched Victoria's expression change as the documents were reviewed. For months, she had spoken with complete confidence. She had convinced investors, neighbors, and herself that the project was unstoppable. But confidence cannot replace evidence. The judge asked questions about the property history, the development documents, and the decisions that allowed construction to continue. Each answer created more uncertainty for Victoria's side. The same paperwork they had used to promote the resort was now showing how much they had overlooked. The most important moment came when the judge looked at the original deed again and confirmed what my family had known for decades. The land belonged to me. Not because I demanded it. Not because I was louder. Not because I had more money. Because the records proved it. I looked over at Victoria and remembered the first day she told me that my property was part of her expansion plan. Back then, she thought I was standing in the way of progress. She never realized I was simply waiting for the right moment to show everyone the difference between building something and actually owning it. The morning after the hearing, I returned to the property before sunrise. The air was cold, the kind of Montana morning where every sound feels sharper. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and the soft crunch of gravel beneath my boots as I walked toward the old fence line. For the first time in months, the land felt quiet again. No construction crews. No engines. No constant reminder that someone had tried to turn my family's history into a business opportunity. The legal process continued after the decision, but the most important thing had already happened. The truth was finally out. The records had spoken. Silver Pines Estates could not ignore what my family had protected for more than 50 years. The resort that Victoria Whitmore built with so much confidence was now facing the consequences of decisions made. Without proper ownership, the same project she once described as her greatest achievement became the reason everyone started asking questions. People in the community began looking back at the documents, the announcements, and the timeline. They realized how quickly everyone had accepted a story without checking the facts behind it. That was the part that stayed with me the most. It was never just about land. It was about how easily people can be convinced when something looks successful from the outside. Victoria had created an image of certainty. She had made people believe that because something was large, expensive, and impressive, it must be legitimate. But the truth does not work that way. The truth does not need a marketing campaign. It does not need a luxury entrance or a room full of investors. It only needs to be documented. A few weeks later, I stood inside my grandfather's old cabin again. The same wooden walls were still there. The same smell of pine filled the room. I placed the original deed back where it belonged, knowing exactly why my grandfather had kept it safe all those years. He understood something that Victoria never did. Real value is not always visible. Sometimes it is hidden inside old records, quiet promises, and the patience to protect what matters. I still drive past the resort occasionally. The buildings are impressive. The design is beautiful. There is no denying that a lot of work went into creating it. But every time I see it, I remember the lesson behind the entire experience. A structure can be built quickly. A reputation can be created overnight. But ownership is something different. It comes from history. It comes from proof. It comes from the truth. Victoria thought she was taking control of a piece of land because she had resources and influence behind her. She forgot one simple thing. The person who owns something does not have to shout the loudest. They only have to show the evidence. And when the moment came, I did exactly that.